The coronavirus is one of the biggest threats to U.S. national security. With the number of cases in the U.S. growing larger than China or Italy, the government is taking drastic measures to fight the disease.
I want to assure the American people that we're doing everything we can each day to confront and ultimately defeat this horrible, invisible enemy. We're at war. In a true sense, we're at war.
President Trump activated the National Guard in California, New York, and Washington to help combat the spread of the virus.
And I want to thank our National Guard. Now, you did such a good job that I'm asking for 4 more from the president.
The administration emphasized that activating the National Guard is not an indication of a plan to move toward martial law.
Martial law is a very specific state of affairs and a very dire state of affairs where the military has taken over all the functions of civil government.
It's like we were in an army camp. We were at war in an army camp.
People's rights should be protected alongside their health and safety.
Some fear coronavirus may be used as an excuse to limit civil liberties in America. Others say the declaration of martial law would be ineffective in combating the disease and an abuse of power. So, how likely is it that martial law will be declared in the U.S. in response to the coronavirus outbreak? Martial law is commonly understood as when the military, and not the judicial system, acts as the supreme power, and armed forces control all aspects of government.
Martial law is a very extreme measure, very unusual measure, which is essentially the replacement of civilian government by military government.
When you bring the military out into a situation of martial law, what you're ultimately saying is we're no longer going to be patient with people's civil rights. We're no longer going to be patient with people's needs and excuses for why they may have to do something that the military doesn't want them to do. The military is ultimately designed to impose will by force. That's what the military is there for.
Martial law occurs only in dire circumstances, where either the local government is no longer able to control a situation or in instances of attacks.
Our system is structured to safeguard the separation between civilian and military government. That is codified in something called the Posse Comitatus Act, which explicitly prohibits the use of federal military forces to execute the law.
While martial law is distinct from the suspension of habeas corpus, the two may happen in tandem when martial law forces courts to close. Habeas corpus is Latin for that you have the body. A writ of habeas corpus means that a prisoner or other detainee must be brought before the court to determine if the person's imprisonment or detention is lawful.
The strict form of martial law that the Supreme Court has required in order to suspend habeas corpus has only come when the courts in fact are closed. And if the courts are open, then you don't have essentially martial law proper. And therefore, you still have the right to habeas corpus to go to those open courts and say, I'm being held unlawfully, I'm being held without charge, etc.
Suspension of habeas corpus, which is extreme and has been an abuse, historic abuse, is really not what is happening now. And our Constitution safeguards against that. If there were any incredibly unlikely abuse of that kind of power, there would be challenges.
Following the over 3-year use of martial law in Hawaii, the Supreme Court's 1946 decision upheld a Civil War case that declared martial law is only constitutional when an emergency forces courts to close.
You can suspend habeas corpus under the Constitution in situations of insurrection or invasion. And so in situations of insurrection or invasion, it often is the case that the courts won't be open, the police won't be able to do their jobs, trash won't be able to be picked up in the ordinary way. So martial law might be necessary. And if martial law is necessary, it may very well be that habeas corpus gets suspended.
While enforcing a quarantine or social distancing orders during the coronavirus outbreak may feel like an infringement on civil liberties, it does not negate the presence of a judicial system and therefore does not suspend habeas corpus.
The social distancing that's being imposed in places like New York City and around the country right now would be much stricter, and your ability to violate those kinds of curfews would probably be much more curtailed if they were being enforced by soldiers.
In fact, advances in technology like video chat allow courts to stay open during isolation and quarantine.
a judge could sit across from them just like you and I are sitting right now and actually hear that case. And so there may not actually be a legitimate reason to suspend habeas corpus. And I'll give you one example of how that's actually played out in practice. Detainees in Guantanamo have habeas corpus here. They have been using this kind of video teleconference that we're all now growing accustomed to for about the past 15 years. I think advances in technology probably make the need to suspend habeas corpus far less than it ever was, when you literally had to go out and literally carry the body into a courtroom that was open. But it also may challenge the basic rules the courts have laid out in habeas corpus cases to understanding when we're in martial law and when martial law is actually truly justified. At the federal level, the power of the president to essentially declare martial law in parts of the country has traditionally only been authorized or approved by the courts where the state government is unwilling or unable to essentially enforce federal law.
People often talk about activating the National Guard as a sign martial law may be declared. Activating the National Guard does not mean that martial law is being enforced. It does mean that the local or state government may need extra assistance from the federal government.
Activation of the National Guard is not inherently martial law. In fact, what the law permits is the use of state National Guards under civilian control, which is the governor's, in order to carry out emergency humanitarian assistance functions.
As of early April 2020, over 30,000 Air and Army National Guard members have been supporting coronavirus response efforts at the direction of their governors. They have helped build and outfit nearly 150 alternate care facilities, providing 83,000 extra beds.
The state government runs most of the day-to-day functions of the government. It's called the police powers. So even quarantines within a state are entirely done by the state. The federal government, by law, only has the authority to use federal power to enforce quarantines between states or at borders.
The National Guard is a unique body that reports to the governor of a state, but may also be called upon for federal responsibilities.
National Guard units can operate essentially under one of three different kinds of statuses. So the first would be state active duty, which is largely what's happening now. The oversight and the command and control authority rests with the civilian governor. There's also something called Title 32 duty, and I'm simplifying when I say that the National Guard troops may be deployed in the service of the United States. They can be federally paid for, but they remain under the control of each state's civilian governor. And then there's something which is more rare, which is Title 10 duty, when the National Guard is deployed by the president for a federal purpose.
The National Guard is often called upon in times of natural disasters, civil unrest, domestic emergencies, and more.
In situations where the president feels that the governor is failing to comply with federal law or is in some way or another resisting federal law, the president can take over the National Guard unilaterally and use it to carry out and protect federal law.
So in this pandemic, if state civilian agencies and resources are overwhelmed and unable to avert disaster, National Guard personnel may provide supporting humanitarian assistance requested by states' governors under civilian leadership and oversight. The National Guard's role in providing this humanitarian assistance should be transparent, it should be time limited, it should be subject to civil rights safeguards and accountability and public oversight.
The National Guard Bureau told CNBC the response is neighbors helping neighbors. The National Guard will conduct these missions in a professional and friendly manner.
I think people should be careful about throwing around the idea and concept of martial law, both because I think it unnecessarily scares people, but it also unnecessarily normalizes an idea that we don't want to normalize. If we treat every use of the military, particularly the National Guard, as encroaching martial law, then you're lowering the threshold for what martial law means.
Martial law has been enacted a few times throughout U.S. history, most significantly during the Civil War and following the attack on Pearl Harbor during World War II.
People point to Hawaii because that is the classic example of replacement of civilian government by military government.
Doris Nye was 11 years old when Pearl Harbor was attacked. She lived under martial law in Hawaii.
So I was on the third floor, and all of a sudden there was this humongous blast, like a bomb going off. And I said, what is that? And so I jumped up and looked out the window, and from our third floor I could see Pearl Harbor. But there was no Pearl Harbor. It was only black smoke. That's all I saw. It was a total, complete takeover. And the worst thing I think about all of the regulations that we had to follow was the blackout. All windows had to be painted black. In case you were caught leaving a light on or whatever, you were then taken in front of a military tribunal. And the tribunals were very hard. The civilian courts had been shut down, so all regulations and everything that were broken went to the military court. You couldn't have an attorney, and you were either fined or sent to prison for the rest of the war at hard labor, or you were forced to give blood.
We know this from history, that the government is prone to committing abuses in times of crisis, and we must ensure that broad claims of power are not misused beyond legitimate needs. And we're watching closely to make sure that that doesn't happen.
The U.S. can look to the international community for how successful martial law may be in combating the virus.
One can think of the People's Republic of China. The use of very stringent measures, primarily quarantine and aggressive social distancing measures, but also aggressive testing and even isolation of people who show symptoms, seems to have proven to be effective.
The National Guard Bureau said there has been no discussion about using the National Guard to enforce a nationwide quarantine, and that the National Guard remains under the control of state governors.
I don't think we're anywhere close to martial law. The society has not broken down to the point where the military is necessary in order to keep society running. But I think we all should be very concerned about whether or not our civil government, if we're funding it enough, that we're giving it the resources and requiring the people who are running our government to be competent enough to actually carry on the functions of government without having to resort to the military.
I understand fears and anxieties are high, but martial law is essentially the replacement of civilian government by military government. That is anathema to American democracy. It is also not what is happening.